Hello everyone. I'm gonna start off by saying that if you are only here to hear a scary story and you are not here to relax or get ASMR tingles, please go to the description and listen to the podcast recording of this story, as Soren Narnia has a very haunting voice in his performance. Is really the best way to hear these stories for the first time. If you are here for the ASMR, then welcome. I am Jake Symbol. This is another story from one of my favorite podcasts, Knifepoint Horror. I am blown away by these stories, and I am so happy that they are licensed under Creative Commons so I can make my own recordings of them. I actually think for October, for Halloween, I'm gonna do some type of series of knife point readings. Just a bunch of knife point readings. Does that sound fun to you? Before I start, I want to recommend that you subscribe and please leave a like. I do a lot of scary story readings. They're one of my main things. Okay, with all that said, I'm going to begin the story. This is called Tarp. My name is Jack Shell. This is the story of two hills, really. I grew up in rural Mattoon, Kansas. My family's farmhouse was on top of one small hill, and across the way, a little higher, were the Rangos. Between the properties was a long depression where a creek had once been 100 years ago, but it was dry and only about 10 feet wide when I was a kid. The Rangos were considered bad seeds. Their property was derelict, always about to be taken by the bank. They survived who knows how, buying and selling and trading things, government programs. You never knew which relatives were living there. I grew up looking at their house on the hill, only occasionally seeing someone up there. Over the years, they had more and more junk strewn around. They didn't like for anyone to see them. My family had no contact with them. We didn't know anyone who really did. One day, in 1933, one of the elder Rangos, I think his name was Peter, trudged up the hill on horseback with another horse tied behind him. That one was weighed down by an enormous piece of folded tarp. A new acquisition, apparently. I watched the Rango's hired hand, a strange man called Tib, drag it off and work to drape it over an old tractor. Most of the time, you could just see its flat tires underneath. The tarp always bothered me. See, when night came and the wind kicked up, I could kind of hear it if I had my window open, rippling, resisting, and looking out my bedroom window to the west, I I saw a bulge all over as the gusts got under it, like a pulsating monster trying to rip itself out of the ground. That sound was repellent, but hypnotic to me, and I would open my window and look up the hill to see if the tarp would maybe escape its moorings. I'd lie on my bed sometimes and listen real hard, and there was that sound, like tiny claps of thunder contained in a small space. The tarp could look like some terrifying dark animal trying to beat its wings and take flight. One time in a rainstorm, I thought it resembled a ghost, striking furiously at what lay underneath it, pounding that decrepit, rusting tractor with its arms again and again, trying to kill it, smother it. I didn't like the tarp. I remember a cold, cloudy winter day when I was walking home from school and a corner of it had folded back somehow, exposing a rear section of the tractor, like it was inviting me to come look, come get closer. I think what scared me most about it was that it just never went away. Spring, summer, winter, fall. It was always there, up the hill. When I was 10, I woke up one morning to see that the tarp had been moved in the middle of the night. Now it was covering the Rango's well, which I guessed was no longer working. I supposed it must have been Tib who did it. Rotund and disheveled Tib, who must have been living on bread and water for what the Rangos probably paid him to do his manual labor. Once, after a snowfall, it was weird. I looked out toward dusk and I saw Tib, with his heavy beard and old clothes, lying on his back and slowly letting himself slide down the Rango's hill that way, as if he were a kid, like me. He wrapped his arms around himself and slid down toward the gully that separated their property from ours, a slow and bumpy descent. When he reached the bottom, he just lay there in the snow, staring up at the sky with his arms positioned like a person does when they're in their coffin, up over the heart. The only way I knew Tib had ever gotten up again was by a set of footprints I saw in the snow the next day, headed back up the hill. In August of 1937, the police came out to the Rango's house. My sister and I watched as 2 cars pulled up, and an ambulance. People gathered around that well and remained there most of the day, and a truck with a winch showed up, and another car with 2 men in suits. Toron Rango, a man in his 80s who'd been living there for a few years, had fallen down the well. The word was that he had been senile and maybe sleepwalking, and he'd wandered too close to it. But our Uncle David, who worked for the county detention center and knew people, told us that the old man had had to peel the tarp back to get underneath into the hole, so he must have been really deluded about what he was doing. Then, my sister was safe asleep in her room, Uncle David told me something else. "Don't tell your dad I told you," he said. There had been long claw marks on the tarp, and little bits of fingernail from where the old man had tried to grab on to stop himself from falling. Claw marks and little rips, 3 feet long, Uncle David said. But life went on up at the Rango's property. In autumn, I watched Tib cement the well over. I had been playing near the gully, throwing a ball up in the air and catching it under a gold gray sky, and I watched him drag the tarp away toward their old barn. When he emerged from it, he saw me, and he raised a hand and smiled a strange smile, revealing a mouth missing half its teeth. I turned away and went back in the house. That night, I went to the window and looked out. The tarp was half inside the barn, half out. It looked like the tongue of some, what's the word? Leviathan. A tongue lolling out of a large, blocky head. It was 2 months like that, and there were times I thought it had crept out more fully into the daylight, just a foot or two, or retreated a little further back into the shadows to fool me. I was 12 when the Rangos won a car in a contest sponsored by Chrysler. Here it came, towed up to the property, a brand new Imperial, gold seal engine, dual carburation. The town talked about it in wonder, but the Rangos, of whom there only seemed to be 4 left now, and who were all older, neither used that thing nor sold it. It sat in the dooryard, neglected. A year after it was won, Tib took the tarp, faded now because of being left out so long in the elements, and dragged it over the car, concealing it from view. No one could really figure out why they were leaving their prize to rot, but it was said they had no skill with or understanding of money, and no offers were entertained for it from the 1 or 2 people who bothered to visit. Some thought the Rangos just wanted everyone to see it on the hill, to know they owned it, in order to earn a little respect. And that made sense in a way. By the age of 14, I shouldn't have been scared of the tarp anymore. And I wasn't, mostly. But the wind and the rain still seemed to animate it in odd ways, and it cloaked that car so totally, with nothing visible underneath, that it seemed like it had eaten the car and was trying to digest it. I remember 3 black birds landing on it once, and standing there, looking in the direction of my bedroom at sunset, and waking up past midnight on Christmas Eve, overly excited for the morning to come, and looking out and seeing Tib getting fatter and more hunched over every year, placing heavy rocks on the four corners of the tarp to keep it more firmly pressed against the ground. That time, my sister came into the room, and we watched him together. She was frail and troubled, and thought Tib was a ghost. "He's not a ghost," I told her, but she thought that as long as I could recall. On Sunday, February 2nd, 1942, I awoke to the sight of snow falling outside my window. 4 inches had settled overnight. It was just past dawn, and the world was cloaked in pale blue and gray. On the hill across the way, there were several cars parked in the Rango's dooryard, and a bunch of people milling about. There was also a hearse from Grovinger's. Most of the activity was centered around the Chrysler. The tarp had been pulled back and all the doors opened. I saw flashlights and the pop of flash bulbs. Then I heard my father bang out our front door and saw him appear at the back of our house, beginning to trudge through the falling snow down our hill. It would be a slow, hard slog across the gully and up to the Rangos, cinching his winter coat tight around him. Within an hour, the tarp had been removed from the car entirely, and it was strung up to cover the open face of the dilapidated sorghum barn. That way, the car could be pushed inside and gone through out of sight, and heaters set up to keep everyone warm for a few hours as they worked. More people showed up throughout the morning, though my sister and I were forbidden after a while to watch. Tib had already confessed by then to his crimes, been taken away forever. The old Rengos, Gorman and Anka, a brother and sister in their 60s, plus their aunt and uncle in their 80s, were all inside the car. 2 in the front seat, 2 in the back, stabbed to death, about 20 times each. But it hadn't happened the night before, no. Those bodies were horribly decomposed and had been for a long time. 2 years, they said. For 2 years, I had seen that tarp covering the car day after day, going to school and coming home from it, and late at night and early in the morning. And for 2 years, the family had been in there, lengthwise on the driver's seat and back seat, concealed, rotting, while Tib went about the business of collecting their checks and tending to what needed to be tended to. It was the milkman who had tipped off the authorities, who'd found Tib's fractured explanations of the Rango's absence more and more bizarre over the past few months. If if we had that big piece of black stuff my friend Scotty had said the summer before, as we had eaten egg sandwiches at the bottom of the hill. I bet we could put it over my fence and it would be like Briggs Stadium. We should take it. But I knew Scotty was in trouble, so I had reminded him the Rangos were strange and maybe dangerous. The murders seemed to cause a permanent change in my sister for the worse, as her imagination ran ever more wild and sleep began to elude her, as it would for the rest of her life. But while others talked endlessly of the bodies and the crime, I watched the tarp, simply left behind after there was nothing more to see. Unnecessary as evidence because the police already had a full confession. Hanging there for the first time, stretched out to its full size, fastened firmly against the sides of the barn. Now the wind seeped into the cracks between the wood and the tarp and caused it to ripple softly and silently like the ripples in every creek, murmuring to itself. I tried not to look. I walked the long way to school so I wouldn't have to skirt the property. I played on the other side of the house or down the road with the Bengtson kids. My father died 2 years later, and my sister and I inherited the farm. We learned that there was more money than we suspected, and my uncle advised us to buy the 2 adjacent properties from the county, one of which was the Rangos, which had been left to wither and die by the tax authorities, who apparently never received a fair price for it. So that is what we did. We bought the Feltons 3 acres and the Rangos tract from the bank. And that is how what lay up the hill remained exactly how it was. The tiny house, the big pen, the barely arable plot, and the barn. There were only 2 kinds of people who had come onto the property since the murders. Property assessors and very occasional strangers whose appearance up there was brief and unexplained. My uncle told me they were likely drawn to the place because they wanted to see where it had happened. They likely had hopes to see the Chrysler, but that had long since been sold off for a debt, or perhaps destroyed. Days upon days, trying to keep the farm going at age 18, with my unreliable uncle off in Topeka and my sister sometimes up at the Haberman home of rest, sometimes home when she was better. So few people believed me when I told them I never once went up the hill in all that time. Never. There was no reason to. The house would be demolished when warm weather came, so there was no need to tend to it. The Rangos' property had nothing to offer us. It was merely a bargaining chip, but we wouldn't sell until things got a little better in Mattoon. August 14th, 1945. I had driven into town and gotten a little drunk with Embry Glasson. The storm came right about last call. We went out and looked at the clouds flowing fast across the sky, and we stood and watched the pouring rain decided I should stay a while at his house before heading back home. Maybe it would let up. He didn't have a radio in his Dodge, so we never knew how bad it's supposed to get. We wound up staying all night, fastening things down around his house because the wind was vicious. Then I told him I had to try to make it home before Wallace Road washed out entirely. It was almost 5:30 a.m. when I pulled in and shut off the engine, and nearly fell asleep right there at the wheel in the pre-dawn dark. I could barely see out the window, the deluge was so heavy. Getting out of the car and running up to the house, I sensed something was wrong. I'll never know how or why that feeling came, but going inside, I was overcome by a feeling of dread, as if I were walking into a crime scene. The first thing I did was go to my sister's room. She wasn't in her bed and the covers were pulled back. I called out to her, searched all over the house. Downstairs, on a little table my mother had made long ago, my sister had left a note. This is what it said. I know he's not a ghost, but I want to make sure he doesn't come back anyway. The prints from my wet fingers washed out her words as soon as I'd read them. I went to the window and looked across our property toward the top of the hill. The little structures the Rangos had left behind were huddled in the dark. I took no flashlight with me when I set out and no umbrella. I didn't care about getting drenched. The wind had picked up even worse, and sometimes as I made my way down the hill, I had to tuck my head down and stop for a second. My feet were soaked in less than 30 seconds. It had gotten just light enough to see them beneath me. I kept wiping the rain out of my eyes. Twice I slipped and went down, both times near the gully when I had to move sideways to keep my balance. It was filling up with rain. It was halfway up my boots when I waded across, and the current was strong enough to make me reach out for the branch of a tiny, struggling tree for balance, almost pulling it out of the ground with my clumsy weight. When I made it to the other side, it was the first time I had touched the Rangos' property since I was 9 years old, and had crept up the hill on a dare from Meredith Pounds. Rain flowed down it now in thin runnels about 20 feet apart. I stood straight. I stood straight and took a deep breath. As soon as I did, the wind hit me full force, and I sunk to my knees to avoid being pushed backward into the gully. The tree I had grasped for balance snapped in half, and the current carried its thin skeleton away. I saw a piece of balsa wood tumbling end over end, several yards in front of me. I began to climb. My My next look at the sky told me we were still in for the worst of it. Around a single gray patch of persistent dawn light was coiled a loop of black that had begun to swirl ever so slightly. I knew tornadoes, and I knew that somewhere close would be hit. Maybe not us. Maybe. With my head down, I saw a green slipper nearby. Before I could reach out to touch it, the wind picked it up and pushed it further away, carrying it sideways across the hill toward Kemshaw Road. My sister's, no doubt. It was light enough to see the barn clearly, and the house. I staggered forward and felt something scrape my neck. Another piece of rotting wood loosed from the property had blown past me. Then I was in the muddy dooryard. The place where the death car had been parked was just to my right. To my left, the barn. The tarp remained fastened stoutly across its open face, even after all this time, but it wouldn't last in that wind. It pounded it, assaulted it. The corner at the bottom right had been undone by someone, and now that piece flapped and danced, dipping first into the barn and then blown out of it, over and over again. That's where I went. When I got to where the barn's mouth was open to anyone disturbed enough to enter, I stopped and picked up my sister's other slipper, and this I put into my pocket. My ears had become clogged with rainwater. I was hearing almost nothing now but a steady thrum, like I was in a tunnel. I had to get in there without touching the tarp. I couldn't touch it. I would die if I did. I stood there timing the wind, waiting until it blew the corner in, when I would have just seconds to enter before it danced again. I ducked my head at the right moment and I stepped in quickly. I'm not sure I ever found out exactly what my sister had used to hang herself. I didn't see much but a silhouette. It was so dark in there. It was so dark in there. It was so dark in there. I timed the wind and ran out again. The tarp strained and tried to wrench free, but it couldn't. I began to descend the hill. Twice as many runnels of rainwater now. I didn't bother angling my body sideways because I didn't care if I fell down. The water in the gully was up to my knees as I went back across. My right foot slipped and I fell into it, swallowing some. My clothes were pasted tight to my body. I stepped right out of my boots, leaving them behind. The wind sounded like a train. It was coming from behind me, and I decided to crawl rather than be knocked over. I heard another tree is snapping somewhere. Tiny bits of mud blew into my eyes, striking them like BBs. There were two tremendous sharp cracks, and I looked behind me. Up the hill, the barn was collapsing. The foundation had given in and it came down in two great sections. It took only 3 or 4 seconds to crash to the ground, and with the quick fading of the echo, its decades-long history vanished. I got up and stood there like a deaf mute, my senses numbed, not wanting to go any further. But the wind pushed me on. Our car was just up ahead, finally. A ferocious gust almost picked me up from behind, and I had to turn my body in the direction of the Rankos to stabilize. The tarp had torn completely free of the ruined barn. The wind had swept under it, and now it was turning end over end, tumbling down the hill, spreading out, stretching out. A hungry raven with broken wings. It was carried down toward the gully, where it would certainly get caught in the stream. But no, the wind picked it up once again and blew it straight across. It thumped and twisted and rolled, now climbing our hill, coming towards me. I remained in place, making no further move toward the car. Here the tarp came, pushed off its path and back onto it again, gaining speed, floating as much as 5 feet off the ground, then crashing back onto it before the next upswell flung it toward me again. At the end, a second before it struck me, I cried out. Then everything went dark as it enveloped me, knocking me backwards off my feet, cloaking me entirely. I tumbled end over end inside that wet, stinking void. Legs bound, arms trapped, screaming. I smelled blood and rot and death. The tarp clutched my skull, strangled me, swallowed my hands, and then it let me go, blown onward, missing the car by no more than a foot, tumbling toward the back of the house and the road beyond. I rose, took 2 more steps, and fell onto the grass one last time, where I remained unconscious for more than an hour, a victim of a bad concussion. When I awoke, the rain was still falling, but the wind had all but ceased. The tarp was gone, blown Christ knows where, down what roads, into what ravines to become someone else's silent phantom. What a horrible, terrible dream, I thought. But no. In the distance, where a barn should be, was a heap of boards and splinters, and my sister was still dead beneath it. And the last meaningful chapter in the story of the Rengo's lonely tract of land had been written. 1947. I am visiting Parish Valier Cemetery. I am finalizing funeral preparations for my Uncle David. He is to be laid to rest between my father and my sister. I walk alone to the grave site. The grave has been freshly dug for the funeral the next day. I see that the whole thing has been lined with a large piece of old black tarp. I summon up the nerve to get closer. I am looking for something. Yes. Yes. Near one of its edges, I see long drag marks and tiny tears left behind by an old man's fingernails. The end. That one was really good. I listened to it a long time ago and I didn't remember much of it, but that one was such a it was simple. It's shorter than his other stories. It has a very classic, mysterious, kind of supernatural horror story ending. I just wanted to remark this thought I had while I was reading it, that I really like in Knifepoint Horror how Soren is really good at, the main characters are always afraid, and he's really good at expressing their fear, at portraying their inner fear. Like in that story, the main character narrator has kind of a phobia of that tarp. The way that he couldn't let the tarp touch him. He would die if it touched him in his mind. And then in the story Staircase that I also did a reading of, this guy hears a creak on his staircase, and for days he's terrified and hyper-vigilant. And then the story Retaliation, which might be my favorite Knifepoint Horror story, is literally about a phobia. It's about a man's phobia being taken advantage of for revenge, and then him getting revenge, and that one is amazing. That's my favorite Knifepoint Horror. I really love these stories. I really love this style and reading his stories, and it's such a gift. So, I'm gonna link Soren's Patreon in the description. All of his stories are Creative Commons and made free to the public, but it's for that reason that I think we should give back. Thank you so much for watching Little Symbols. I hope that you are ready to fall asleep or wake up from your nap, or that you're just loaded with tingles and goosebumps.